Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Confabulating. We are delighted to be joined this evening by Dr. Miriam Tveit of Norwegian University, who will be delivering a talk entitled The Ambiguity of Urban Hospitality in the Norwegian Realm, 1100 to 1350. Miriam is an associate professor in the Faculty of Social Sciences at Nord University. She worked with Scandinavian and European medieval law, particularly processes and politics around legislation. She completed her Ph.D. in Cultural and Social Sciences from the University of Tromsø with a thesis entitled In Search of Legal Transmission, Inheritance and Compensation for Homicide in Medieval Secular Law. She's published a wide variety of books, chapters, and articles from 2007 to 2024 on subjects such as urban legal procedure in 14th century Norway and comparative perspectives in Scottish and Norwegian legal history, the invisible poor in Norwegian and Danish town laws, health and hygiene regulations in 12th to 14th century Norwegian towns, and law, politics, and society in the Norwegian Middle Ages. Additionally, she has edited several books on European center-periphery relations in the Middle Ages. Her most recent publication is entitled Introduction, Crossing Urban Legal Boundaries in Northern Europe, Merchants and the Law, 1350 to 1600, in Urban History by herself and Edda Frankot. She also organised with Therese Tuv and the call for papers Magic in Times of Crisis, Means to Explain, Heal and Harm at Nord University in July 2024, and has been involved in Museum Nord's exhibition group celebrating the 750th anniversary of the law code of Magnus VI Haakonsen. Miriam, thanks so much for joining us this evening. It's fantastic to have you with us.
Thank you so much for this very rich introduction. So, thank you for inviting me to this talk. And it's based on a study I did in our forthcoming volume on the hospitality in the Middle Ages, edited by IHSHG and Lars Kjær, which is one of the output of their project on ambiguous hospitality in the Middle Ages. So, ambiguous for many reasons. Consider, for instance, the likeness of the terms hospitality and hostility, host and hostage in the modern English language. And similar terms can be found in Latin, for instance, hospice for host and hostus for enemy. So my contribution there is a study of hospitality in the towns of Norway in the Middle Ages. And I will present parts of that study here. So let's begin with establishing two factors. First of all, hospitality was, as you can probably imagine, an essential element of medieval urban life, which was largely reliant on outside contact with traders, travelers, guests. And catering for these temporary visitors must have formed a part of the structure, and also guesting merchants were a strong presence in all the northern European towns. And second of all, the Norse culture, which is mainly from Iceland and Norway and the islands between, if you know this region. It presented hospitality as the arena for political discourse among the elite. And hospitality was a core value in this Norse culture, seen as in the famous sort of god poem Håvamål, and it's the first section, which is called the Gestaþáttur, the guests part. And in this poem, there's a strong expectations of reciprocity, and this is why Marcel Mauss highlighted Håvamål in the start of his classic work, The Gift. While social exchange within the Norse elite has been widely studied, the type of hospitality that arises from economic relations has not yet been explored in any great detail. And such relation between hosts and guests has a more transactional and also ambiguous aspects. And likewise, a lot has been done on the topics of privileges of foreign merchants, particularly the Hansa, the German trade network, and their part in the Norwegian towns. But hospitality towards the short-term visitors or domestic visitors has received quite little or no attention. And historian Tobias Bolstad has pointed out that unlike guest, the term guest, hospitality is almost never mentioned as such in the sources about trade. And also Rosa Salzberg has pointed out in her studies that encounters between people on the move and urban inhabitants remain obscured. So now I look at how urban hospitality was represented within the Norwegian realm, which comprised of Norway proper, plus Iceland, Shetland, Orkney, and the Faroe Islands, and also parts of Greenland at one point. By juxtaposing two different kind of category of sources from this realm, both of which relate to guests in town, and both of which adopt a sort of idealistic perspective. The normative sources, no, the normative laws, legal sources, and the fictional sagas. And the aim is to identify perceptions of guest status in urban settings in these sources, and consider how Norse culture saw hospitality towards these guests. So town life was quite the exception in the Norwegian realm, as you can see from this map on the right here, from Scandinavia around 1300. In Norway, it's estimated that about 5% of the population lived in towns, and the few dominantly coastal towns that existed were nevertheless very important. They were hubs for trade and governmental and clerical administration, and they also received quite a lot of visitors. So in Old Norse, the words for guest, guesting, and having guests, there are certain words for that, but there are no precise terminology for hospitality itself. And also the concept of urban hospitality is not discussed explicitly in the literary or the normative sources. It is, however, possible to infer from these sources sort of understanding of and attitudes towards hosting guests in the town. So the sources I talk about here, the legal sources, are the two known collections of urban laws from the late 12th and late 13th century respectively, plus a number of decrees and privileges. And the literary sources that I have looked at here consist of Icelandic sagas, Islandiga sagas, as well as other narratives and short stories, from Icelandic authors. And it's important to note that although these short stories often describe events from the 11th century or even earlier, they primarily date from the 13th and 14th centuries and are thus contemporary with the legal sources, as are the representations of hospitality. So the two categories together, I hope, will give an idea of the expectations there were towards urban hospitality in the Norse world. So let us first consider how authorities perceived hospitality and how best to ensure it. So despite the need for quite detailed regulation regarding the influx of guests, the existing urban legal corpuses comprises very little legislation that actually addresses guests and how to deal with them. There was still a concern for unwanted elements within communities, such as drifters, journeymen, and servants, and they could arrive in the towns from the countryside or from elsewhere. And there's this one rule from the 1270s, and it addresses the danger of welcoming strangers into one's home. And it says that the town sheriff is to declare that people are not to take into the house those people who run from the east or west, north or south, unless they know them to be just men. and such people have the habit of being somewhat useful, but then they steal people's property and run away with a man's housewife or his kinswoman. And anyone who does otherwise is to pay a fine of a mark of silver, which is sort of the value of a cow, so it's quite a heavy fine, to the king if this guest is proven to be bad. So the essence of the rule is that people should know what kind of guests they are housing and to vouch for them. And a few other regulations concerning hospitality relate to two fundamental issues in medieval urban law in general in Europe, and that is keeping the peace and social control. And these laws say that a landlord should know whether the guest had been inside during the night, and to provide such information if there had been a robbery, for instance. And thus the host were answerable for any offences committed during the guest's stay. And according to the town law of 1276, the landlord was given a much larger fine than the lodger if the lodger broke the law in all kinds of minor offences. So tenants were fined only the 1/8 part, so 1 to 8 of what the owner, the host, was fined. And the host also had to stand surety for the guests and had to represent them in the town's legal system, and to pay the fines if a visitor broke the law and subsequently disappeared. And those who aided a tenant in avoiding rent, for instance, they were also liable 8 times more in a fine than the guests. So by holding the locals accountable for the behavior of guests, the law laid down a sort of flimsy foundation for a culture of urban hospitality. And since much of the legislation clearly favors the privileged group of householders, it's quite notable that these house owners' interests as hosts are not further acknowledged. So the number of people a landlord could bring into their house was also restricted to 5, 2 men and 3 women. And the landlord was also answerable if any member of their household was found begging in other quarters. And this was part of a general policy of the Norwegian government of preventing the accumulation of poor in the towns. And this politics also included a system of poverty relief that made the urban poor themselves sort of guests, in brackets, of the townhouses. The urban households were required to offer hospitality in a system which was literally called the moving of poor people. And one household had to house a poor person for one night before they were moved to the next property. And this system was also had been in force for many years before this law, and other sources attest to that this sort of forced hospitality with this constant rotation was considered a great burden both for the households and the sick poor that were moved around, as you might imagine. So in the town law of 1276 there was a distinction made between visitors and citizens in the explanation of the town's collective duties, among them pulling ships in the harbor, which is sort of hauling ships along the quay or ashore for maintenance. And this rule opens with a statement that all share in this collective duty. All merchants shall go to the ship pulling immediately when the horn sounds, whether they are from the north or the south, when they have stayed 3 nights in the town. Householders and district men shall also go to ship pulling, like the merchants, if they have stayed 3 nights in the town. So the rule establishes the authorities' distinction between short-term visitors on one side and guests that were more involved in the society they were visiting. So it covered both district men, so from the nearby districts, visiting from the surrounding countryside, and the merchants from much further away. And temporary stays above a certain time, this 3 nights rule, within the urban boundaries entailed an obligation towards the town they were visiting. And this 3-night rule was generally known in medieval Europe. You can find it in other towns as well. And urban hospitality is here a question of temporality. The studies of mobility and migration has often focused on how migrants aim to remain in their destination more permanently, even though most of the sort of movement between urban centers were quite temporary. And in relation to the question of hospitality, it's relevant that the limit of 3 nights gave the outsiders themselves a peculiar sort of quality, distinguishing between those whose visits were brief encounters and those with more lasting engagement with the town and its population. So that was the laws, and if we then look at the saga texts, we found numerous observations regarding the concept of hospitality. In these, we meet a rural guest, a guest from the country, typically Icelandic, so from Iceland, in an urban setting, which was typically a Norwegian town. So the saga literature offers valuable insights into the diversity of guests in medieval towns, presenting the guest's perspective against the laws of the host communities. And we must remember that these stories were made for an Icelandic audience, and they depict how Icelandic authors imagine how the Norwegian hosts sort of sees them. And the sources are very valuable as they consider other groups in addition to these merchants. So you have so many other sources for. And a common theme in this saga stories is the Icelandic visitor in a Norwegian town, or Icelander with a Norwegian king, as Harris has pointed out. And these tales typically unfold in a major trade town like Bergen or Nidaros, one of the most important towns for trade with the rest of Europe. And here the Icelandic protagonist typically outwits his opponents, and then he impresses the assembly, the legal system, and in the end of the story he usually gains the king's favor. So dramatic events often follow a guest's arrival, and in the Harda saga we meet this Brynjolf, and he invites the protagonist Hardar and the group he travels with to stay with him in Bergen in a townhouse, because he thinks that Hardar is a very fine man, and he deserves to stay, it says, with high-ranking men, although he's not a high-ranking man himself. So one of the Icelanders in his entourage then quarrels with a group of Norwegians in Bergen, and one of the Norwegian is in the service of the king's mother, and he is hurt and dies as a result of this quarrel. And then the host Brynjolf has to pay the fine on behalf of his guests, which is he can do that because he's quite wealthy. And if we interpret these stories like this, from the perspective of hospitality, the way in which Brynjolf acts as the Icelanders' host becomes meaningful. He enables them to become guests, and he also is the rescuer. And the virtue and practices of hospitality sort of hinge on his conduct and status, and as the town regulations decree, actually, as we saw in the laws before. And he accepts all legal responsibilities for his guests. But more importantly, Brynjolf, the host, he spells out the expectations of the guest and the attributes that they need to be to be worthy of reception. And this is sort of courage, beauty, and strength, or all three of them. And the host too need to embody certain qualities such as wealth, status, and hopefully ties to the royal court. And the guest-host relation is thus presented as one that is a bit unequal, but where both sides has attractive qualities that benefit the other party. So this dual promise of strangers is always present. A guest could have ill intentions, or they could come with legitimate claims of vengeance. This was a vengeance culture. So we see in the short story about Ogmundar, he sails to Nidaros, this modern day Trondheim, and he does this to take revenge after suffering and defamation. And because of a coincidental sort of swap of capes and swap of information with the story's other main figure, which is the local man Gunnar, Ogmundar, the other person, he manages to get close to and kill his insulter. And Gunnar here represents the host. He already welcomed Ogmundar, the visitor from Iceland, upon his arrival in the harbor. But this was because he was curious, and because he had a fantasy, a sort of fetish for two-colored things. So he liked Ogmundar's two-colored fleece. So Gunnar wears Ogmundar's cape, and in the mix-up, he is accused for the murder that Ogmundar did, and he has to flee town. And through Gunnar's sort of naive welcome of the Icelandic guest, the story depicts a sort of universal duality of hospitality as one of the, on the one hand, offering the possibility of obtaining news, while on the other hand, risking the status quo. And this duality, I think, is further reflected in Gunnar's fetish for this double, two-colored things. And this leads him to be framed for murder, actually. The sagas, these Icelandic sagas, they frequently include skaldic poems, so sort of bards' poems. And these skalds, the poets, they themselves are often portrayed as visitors to the town. And in one of this short story of the skald Einar from the early 13th century, the story explores him as a sort of outsider in the town. And one theme occurs in Bergen and introduces visiting musicians. So there were a lot of musicians coming into the town, and one of these steals and eats a goat on a Friday. So this is a double breach of both secular law, which is theft, and canon law, which is he did not abstain from meat on a Friday. And this leads to Hjalmar being whipped, which is also in line with what the law says. And the skald Einar asks the king for mercy on behalf of his fellow. And the king replies that the man will be whipped for as long as it takes the skald to produce a poem about it. And this turns out to be approximately 5 lashes. And this category of musicians, leikarar, they have in Icelandic law, so not Norwegian law but Icelandic law, they have been likened to beggars, so sort of poor, a category of poor people begging in Iceland. And the tale depicts a view of the minstrels, the sort of artists, as untrustworthy. It also hints at their association with between this class of artists and poverty, and thus not suitable for witnessing in court, for instance, and other things. So by association, minstrels were represented as popular but untrustworthy, and Einar's association with the other musician who succumbed to these unchristian temptations and theft shows his dubiousness yet cunningness. He was a cunning man, Einar, and this reflects on the group of visiting artists as a whole. So the same Icelandic saga of Einar the Skald features the scene of arrival and departure of Ragnhild, a female merchant who is visiting Bergen and then leaving again. And she is depicted as a wonderful woman, it says, with a very nice longship, and she has a very nice behavior worthy of an aristocrat. And her disposition fascinates everyone in the harbor who is looking at her while she is preparing to depart, filling her longship with goods that she has bought in Bergen. And this includes the king. He is also watching her prepare to leave. And the king laments that there are no skalds, no poets to come there and commemorate the scene with making a poem about her departure. So then Einar Skald again is brought to the king's side and asked to produce a poem about her departure. And he does this for the payment of promise of 1 measure of honey, a sort of small barrel of honey, for every word of the poem that the king and his 7 of his men that are present cannot subsequently remember. So for every word they forget, he will get a jar of honey. And in this poem he praises Ragnhild as a merchant and attractive woman, and he likens her bosom to the swelling of the ship's sail. So nice little skaldic poem there. And the king and his men, they only remember the first and the last verse of this poem, and this provides Einar with a handsome reward. He gets a lot of honey. The story constructs the guests in quite positive terms, as welcome and interesting. And Ragnhild is a welcome visitor, and her departure is portrayed as somewhat bittersweet for the onlookers. So the preparation for a guest's departure creates a spectacle for the townsmen, and read alongside the musician, the artist's bad behavior, both the descriptions of the locals' kind of excitement and the guest's deception of them. It offers an image of the guest as an exciting contribution to Norwegian town life. So, to sum up some of the findings here, the intersection between ideals of hospitality, which were widespread in the Norse culture, and urban life, which was quite marginalized, we see a rare opportunity for improving our understanding of the often overlooked aspect of Norse culture. And furthermore, the 2 different source categories contain elements of how hospitality is presented in the other category. So the literary narratives comprise the skepticism towards strangers that we find ingrained in law, and vice versa. And together these complex images of urban hospitality reveal the ambiguous character of its practices and the discourses, which were also applicable to the frequent meetings that occurred in the port towns of the Norwegian realm. So studying urban hospitality through these two types of sources, both of which are based on sort of imagined models, ideal models. They offer insights into Norse ideas of guests and hosts. And still these text categories, they do not present a simplified or stylized image of the guest, nor the host. What emerges is a more complex image of the guest-host relation, and probably more in line with what is often assumed to be the reality in medieval Norwegian town. And this complexity of the image extends our knowledge of how contemporary observers maybe understood the fleeting temporary and the more permanent hospitality in the Norse world. So thank you for your attention.
Miriam, thank you so much. That was fascinating, I think, especially the kind of way that the literary and legal sources kind of speak to each other like that and reveal, as you said, like that very ambiguous way that guests can be seen as perhaps a point of interest, but also potentially as a point of trouble as well. I think there's some really sort of interesting kind of points that got drawn out in that discussion. I'd like to begin with a point that you mentioned at the start, that sort of hospitality isn't sort of specifically included as a word, although it kind of appears indirectly. I'm really intrigued with that because it seems to me that this was obviously a really important concept from both a kind of legal perspective and as part of a literary device. So, yeah, just out of interest, do you think there was maybe a reason why, like, sort of there wasn't really a word kind of settled on that?
I'm not sure there's a reason why it's not any specific word is used, but it's written in so many other sort of phrasings, and the description of the elite political scene in the 11th century. So there's this 13th century sources describing the political events of the 10th and 11th century. And you often find this description of a feast. One chieftain has a feast and others are arriving, and then there's this tension in the room. Maybe some hostility plays out, and killings occur, and then vengeance and so on. And the other thing you can see is a more also a bit hostile version of hospitality, which is hostages, or the friendlier version about fostering. So they're fostering each other's sons or daughters, and sometimes these fosterings create a very tight bonds between foster parents and children, and sometimes not. And so there's so many descriptions of guesting, but there is no term itself for hospitality that we can extrapolate. No?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting stuff. And I think, especially as you said, like the way that almost linguistically there's a real similarity between, kind of having somebody in your care in a positive way and that being the case in a very hostile way. And I think that's fascinating that we get that. And as you say, the fact that it gets kind of played out in lots of other comparable contexts. I think that's really fascinating, just even the way that it's kind of spoken about and conceived.
Yeah, and what is, I was mentioning this volume that will come out of the project, that's with several other contributors, and some of them write about the sort of two sides of the feast and the battlefield, and how a battlefield can be like a feast and vice versa. So there's a lot of danger, but this is also mainly described in the medieval sources as sort of high politics, and also the battle scenes. They you have, for instance, in the Sverre saga, that he prepares for the battle as if he was expecting a good friend for visit. So it's an interesting double-sided.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess especially kind of comparing the rules of war versus, say, the rules of kind of having a guest in your house and how that kind of tension can continue to break out. It's, yeah, really fascinating. Like, I'd sort of never considered that they're almost sort of two sides of the same coin in some ways, like sort of from the level of like even kind of speaking about it all the way up to kind of these wider like societal structures and things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is not exclusive for the Norse world. That this tension and the double-sidedness is sort of, you can find it all over the European and Eurasian world, and everywhere else, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'm quite intrigued with these kind of laws that kind of place a lot of emphasis on the host to sort of account for the behavior of their guests. I don't suppose, do we know anything at all about like if that influenced the way that guests were subsequently treated, with hosts kind of knowing that, they have to take responsibility for the behavior of people in their care?
Not directly, but indirectly, maybe. There are, unfortunately, very few sources that say anything about this sort of more normal urban life or rural life in Norway before 1300. And afterwards, you get a lot of charters of small transactions and property transaction, inheritance, and so on. But the sort of breach of the law of the minor offenses, we don't have any receipts for the fines paid or urban registers where all these minor offenses has been recorded, unfortunately. But there is also very little about public tavernas from Norway, and this is a sort of concept that you'd find when you think about a medieval town and in all the Norwegian towns. So I had this image here. The last is from a fantastic exhibition that Lego made about the Hanse, the contour around the Europe. And this is a little pub in Bergen. And these tavernas were usually also hostels or places you could sleep. But there are no sources of this from the Norwegian towns, which is strange. There's just one from this King Håkon that I mentioned earlier that was describing the rotation system of the poor. He also has decreed that there are no tavernas in rural Norway, which is vast, big, and very sparsely populated. So it's travelers who go by land, they cannot find food and shelter in the right distances when they're traveling in Norway, so he demands that there are built tavernas along the main routes for 1 day's ride. And they will have the king's mark, and they will get paid the tavernas, those who run it. But this is the countryside and not the towns. So my point is that most of the visitors are assumed to have private lodgings or sort of semi-private lodgings. But that's based on that we don't know anything. But you would imagine that if you had to pay 8 times the fines of your lodger if they did something bad, this is quite intimidating to enter into, to become a host of people you don't know, at least. So you would imagine that it would be difficult to get a place to stay in Bergen, for instance. But there are no such sources that say anything about such problems, so we don't know.
Yeah, as a pity, because as you say, like I think it does set up this really interesting kind of dynamic where I can expect that people, would have needed, places to stay when they were kind of visiting urban areas. But I can imagine people would have been cautious. And again, speculating, of course, but I think, as we've established, people would likely kind of be nervous about kind of taking people in. Just kind of knowing that there was that kind of pressure that, if something went wrong, they would be infinitely more liable than their guests would be, if they committed a crime.
They would. If we compare with what we know from the other side of the coin, the guests, there is, at least from the late medieval period, quite a few sources from merchants, the Hansa merchants, the Flemish merchants, and when they were traveling between each other to England, to London, for instance, or Aberdeen, and they too had, regulations from their hotels about how to behave when they went elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also, if they got into trouble, for instance, if the hosts were trying to cheat them or in some way, they were treated badly in this strange port. So I think the both hosts and guests would have, in general, have been cautious and probably have some sort of network. And what you see of the Hansa is that they had a network, so they would, in Bergen, they would have lodgings for German guests in their own quarters if they were part of this, for instance, the Lübeck merchants and Kampen merchants and so on. But other people would probably also have knowledge of someone, or know someone through someone, and these networks would have been very important, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, definitely. Kind of making sure that you could kind of link up with somebody before you kind of made the journey into the unknown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That being said, I don't think Bergen was the most dangerous town in Europe. It was about 7,000. So there are a few sources who tested, for instance, German being drunk and there being some sort of fights going on in the harbor and so on.
Yeah, kind of all the regular stuff you could imagine, like with people kind of coming in and out of like ports and things like that. Yeah, and I guess, and perhaps this is slightly my ignorance showing, and kind of, correct me if I'm kind of wrong with my kind of perception of this, but one thing I find really interesting is the fact that sort of there's this sort of ambiguity in urban spaces where, I imagine it would have been more commonplace to have kind of people coming in and out. Whereas I think from what I can perceive, like in the countryside, there's a kind of call for like there to be more like taverns, more places to host people. Was it the case that hospitality in rural areas had a similar dynamic, or was this just a kind of urban thing?
Yeah, we see the same sort of the first law that I showed you about not taking in strangers that you did not know knew to be good people. You can also find similar in the law of the rural areas, but you don't have the same regulation of the duties of the host to stand surety and to represent them in court. So, but it was probably the same. But these rural areas, they would not have that many visitors passing by. I think that most of the Norwegian fjords and communities were quite remote from each other. So it would probably be among the main travel routes in the inland. And in these saga stories, which is what we have next to the laws, you have several examples of people spending the night somewhere, getting into trouble, and then this whole sequence of vengeance starts. but otherwise there's very little we know. But I would the culture demands that people would take in travelers when they came by and needed a place to stay, but maybe just in the stable with the horse.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I can well imagine that if you're living sort of out, kind of in a village, like in a very remote region, then it would have been kind of less of a kind of thing to sort of worry about. Whereas if you were perhaps say like in a town by the Hanseatic League and you had sort of merchants coming in and out on a fairly regular basis.
Probably yes, but also if you were not used to seeing a lot of strangers pass by, you would be quite surprised when they first came.
Oh, for sure, yeah. And yeah, I guess just for curiosity's sake, was this kind of legislation consistent across kind of all parts of kind of the Norwegian world? Or do we see sort of any differences in, say, places like, some of the kind of the islands out in the Atlantic or over in Greenland or Iceland?
No, there's no similar regulations from the other islands that we see. But you have the Icelandic laws. They also, to some degree, describe the same. It's a sort of rural law, and they would also have regulations for how to treat strangers, sort of, but not very typically in a sort of host-guest relationship.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Interesting. And I guess sort of moving on to the literary sources, what really struck me was how, kind of you could have sort of visitors who came, and we got this kind of classic trope of them, kind of getting into trouble and the host kind of, having to pick up the pieces, so to speak. But it's interesting that then you also got, for example, the example of the female merchant who kind of, really amazed the town, and the king kind of lamented her departure.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in that. I suppose, is there sort of any hard and fast rules about like who would be considered like, kind of a good visitor, so to speak, and who wouldn't? Or does it kind of really depend on like the context of the story and kind of the narrative, as it were?
These protagonists are the Iceland protagonists in these sagas. They are usually described in the same way as this other, not this woman, but the other four examples that I had, as cunning, clever, but also with a sort of agenda. So they're usually both tricking everyone and also getting into more trouble as the story goes along. But so no, this story of this woman is quite exceptional, I think, and it's rare that you see such a story describing a strange woman in this fashion, and also her being a merchant, which was a nice detail there. So, but that's not made an issue of, that she is a merchant or that she is traveling with this longship. But other than that, she's behaving herself in a good way and carrying herself in a good way, and people like to look at her. That's the three qualities she have.
Right. And I guess with that kind of absence of kind of any kind of mischief or bad behavior, I guess that's almost kind of something that kind of plays into it as well.
Yeah, so she's a sort of contrast to these conniving figures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sort of interested, kind of going back to the more kind of legal kind of element of it. When it came to like kind of the host having to take on like responsibility and being punished more so than the guests, do we know kind of what the legal thinking was behind that? Yeah.
I am not sure. I've been thinking about this, but it must be in relation to the fellow neighbors of the town. That if you compare with other rules in the same law, you have a responsibility for your community and to ensure this general order and safety of the town, and that your house should be built in the right way with the right dimensions, that your oven should be put out so you don't cause fire hazards, and in the same way you should be accepting guests that are reliable and not contribute to a sort of gathering of suspicious figures in town. There's another rule that says that the people you employ should not have been known to do not theft but petty theft. So if you employ people who have done petty theft, then you should be fined. And I guess that plays into the same dynamic that everyone who lives in the town should contribute to the health and safety for everyone.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it's like that sort of civic duty, and if you bring somebody and they breach that, then that's almost you by proxy kind of breaching like the peace and the kind of good governance of the town by letting this person do what they will.
I think so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess are there any kind of elements of this topic that you'd like to learn more about? Or is there anything that the sources don't reveal that you'd sort of like to kind of dive into more? I know we've already talked a bit about like say reactions to these laws, but yeah, is there sort of anything else that you think would be interesting to explore that kind of hasn't really been kind of looked into in sort of the same detail?
Yeah, there are a few other source categories that could be looked at, like more what should we call them? Church sources, or sort of letters between bishops and accounting, and letters to and from the Pope and so on. But I don't think it will reveal a lot. But maybe say something about another category of guests that haven't been talked about here, and that is the clergy who also traveled between towns primarily for different reasons, and also pilgrims to and from. And Nidaros was the center of pilgrimage for Saint Olaf, which was a very popular saint in the Middle Ages. So there are a few of those categories, but also compare more with these sort of minor offenses done by visitors in other areas of Europe. Would be really interesting. There's a lot of sources, Italian sources, for instance, and also in the Dutch and German towns. That could be interesting to compare with, because they are sort of connected by trade also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and kind of see like kind of how those laws align with each other. Because I think that'd be interesting to kind of see. Like, I think as you've already mentioned, this was clearly something that was thought about quite a lot in lots of different urban contexts, where kind of people were kind of coming into contact with each other. So it'd be interesting to kind of see like how that kind of translated to kind of different parts of Europe, and if it's similar, if there were differences. I think that would be a really interesting comparative study. And on that sort of former point, is there anything you know about the sort of the more religious elements of hospitality? I know that we've spoken a little bit about how beggars were asked to be kind of kept, kind of in the houses of wealthy people, and possibly things to do with pilgrims. But was there anything to do with the kind of more religious dynamic?
Do you mean this rotation system?
Mm-hmm. I suppose in general, like, is there anything that the church kind of had to say? Were there any kind of expectations laid down from a kind of religious perspective?
Yeah, that's the Norwegian towns had hospitals built by the church as other towns, but not usually. There was one in each town, and Bergen had two. And but these were hospitals for the sick mainly, but also for the poor. And they would have been very important in the catering for the poor and trying to solve any such issues in the town. But they were not, as we know at least, big centers for visiting pilgrims. They would have had a center in Nidaros for the pilgrims who came there. And there are a few monasteries outside in the countryside that have, a sort of guest house for visitors visiting clergy from other monasteries, or the bishop, or some clerical figure came by. But not much is known of such guest houses in towns.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, fortunately not. Because I guess that'll be another kind of obviously kind of big element of kind of civic life. Yeah. So yeah, it would be interesting to kind of see like how that kind of played into this framework that we already have. Yeah. And I suppose I'm interested, kind of just taking a step back and kind of in researching this topic. How did you find sort of guessing, like, say, the kind of two different types of sources to kind of speak to each other? It seems like that there was some quite good kind of themes that both kind of touched on, but yeah, did you find that, or did you kind of encounter any challenges with kind of getting these sort of, I guess, kind of two quite different types of documents to kind of communicate?
Yeah, in to work on another topic about the town assembly, I went through a lot of these short stories with the Icelanders visiting Norwegian towns, and I saw how it's usually a legal element in all the stories, and also that these legal references or procedures usually follow the town law, or almost follow the town law and the procedures described there. So it's I would say there's a quite good connection between the stories and the laws, and there must be a sort of knowledge about what the town laws prescribed for people to do. For the authors that wrote these Icelandic sagas. So yes, they are communicating very well, and it's very nice to have them parallel. It's and these are the two main source categories that we have in a very sort of sparse sources for medieval Scandinavia and the Nordic countries. So it's great when you can use them together like this.
Yeah, definitely. So especially when they align well, and like there's kind of really fertile ground for research.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, good stuff. Good stuff. And finally, if our listeners want to learn more about this topic, are there any particular resources that you would recommend that they check out?
Well, there's a common book which will treat hospitality in all levels of society in both Armenia and England and Jerusalem, and so it's going to be a great publication. But there are also a book about hospitality in the Baltic region, and so that's just quite a little research. For urban hospitality, there's not that much, but this Rosa Salzburg, she's writing about Venice, which is a major trade port, and many more guests than the Norwegian towns would have. But if they want to look into source categories, then there would be a few urban records that they could check out, and that is in the Hanseatic towns, English, and also some of the Scottish towns, And the Dutch towns, they have very rich urban records for usually the late medieval period, but mostly mostly the late medieval period, but also the earlier. So that's a very interesting source category to look into.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Well, Miriam, thanks so much for your time. It's a really fascinating topic that kind of covers all sorts of different areas, as we've seen. So thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you for inviting me.
Not at all. And thanks for everybody at home listening. Hope you join us for the next episode. Until then, take care. Goodbye.